From the cold black of the void, where suns are no more than distant embers, and silence weighs heavier than any world's atmosphere, there comes a breed of warrior that does not march to the measured cadence of the Codex Astartes. They do not fight in the tempered discipline of Ultramar, nor in the cunning strikes of the Raven Guard, nor even in the fanatical zeal of the Black Templars. They are something older in spirit, something raw, something that has survived from the most primal days of war, the unrestrained fury of the predator that knows only kill or be killed. They are the Steel Berserkers, and their name is both a promise and a curse. To some they are saviours, the embodiment of the Emperor's wrath incarnate. To others, they are a barely leashed monstrosity, a sanctioned abomination that should have been purged long ago. And to themselves, they are simply what the galaxy has made them. Weapons without sheath or safety, burning until the day they shatter. The Imperium of Man, vast beyond comprehension, has always been desperate for warriors. It is an empire perpetually on the brink of annihilation, its borders gnawed at by alien predators, its heartlands rotted by heresy, its worlds cracking under the weight of their own populations. The High Lords of Terror, with their endless lists of sectors aflame and fronts collapsing, have sanctioned foundings of new Space Marine chapters in times of great need. Some foundings are celebrated, recorded in grand annals, others are whispered of in footnotes, born from desperation and buried in shame. The Steel Berserkers were of the latter breed, a creation less from vision than from necessity, and less from necessity than from the willingness to gamble with what should never be risked. No one will admit the precise date or number of their founding. Official records, when they exist at all, are inconsistent. Some place their genesis in the 21st founding, the cursed founding, when genetic experimentation reached dangerous extremes. Others suggest they were a quiet creation in the years following the Macharian Crusade, intended to patrol the ravaged sectors left behind by that legendary conqueror. But there is one common thread in every tale. The seed from which they were grown was not pure. It bore in it the echo of an older flaw, a hunger that in other chapters had been restrained, but here was deliberately intensified. Perhaps it was the red thirst of the Blood Angel's lineage, pushed beyond the limits of sanity. Perhaps it was the butcher's nails madness of the World Eaters, refined into something more stable or more deceptive. Perhaps it was both. The truth has been sealed in vaults that no mortal may open, and the keepers of those vaults do not speak. What is certain is that their inception was tied to a single, unyielding premise. There are wars in which precision is irrelevant, strategy is secondary, and only the sheer merciless application of violence will suffice. Hive, fleets that devour in days, orc warriors that sweep over subsectors, heretic uprisings too numerous for clean suppression. These are not battles won by careful plans. These are battles won when the enemy is not merely defeated but crushed, their will to resist extinguished in blood and iron. The Steel Berserkers were made to be the hand that delivers such victories. Their earliest trials were fought in the dark of the void and the hellscapes of broken worlds. In one of their first deployments, the Ash Marches campaign, they were sent to relieve a beleaguered guard regiment on Tregan's Hold, a mining moon under siege by orcs. By the time their fleet arrived, orbital auspex showed the guard's last bastion reduced to rubble, green tides surging through shattered streets. In another chapter, the order might have been to secure a landing zone, regroup and push back with disciplined force. The Steel Berserkers did not wait. They drove their drop pods straight into the largest orc mob and emerged already charging, chain blades howling, bolt pistols firing in point-blank execution shots. The orcs, drunk on slaughter, found themselves prey to a predator far more terrible. Within 3 hours, the orc presence was reduced to scattered warbands fleeing into the mines, most hunted down in the tunnels over the next day. It was a victory of terrifying speed, an equally terrifying cost. By the end, less than a third of the guard survivors remained alive, many killed by stray fire or in the Berserkers' heedless charges. The Imperial commander commended their success, through gritted teeth. Such was the paradox of the Steel Berserkers from the first. They did not fight with allies. They fought through them. Every war zone they entered was reshaped in their image, a cauldron of close-quarters carnage, where lines collapsed into whirlwinds of melee, where artillery barrages became irrelevant in the chaos. Even their own battle brothers within a war company often found themselves swept up in the tide of rage, the cohesion of their force dissolving into hundreds of individual duels and hunts across the battlefield. This was not disorder born of weakness, but of a different order entirely, the order of predators loosed in a pen. It was not only their battlefield manner that set them apart, their very recruitment ensured the survival of their temperament. Their homeworld, Karag-Tor, was a place seemingly chosen to breed savagery. It orbited a dying red star, its crust cracked by endless volcanic convulsions, its skies choked with ash and metallic dust. The air was heavy with the scent of scorched iron, and the ground was a labyrinth of jagged basalt and rivers of molten ore. Life clung here not by adaptation, but by violence. The human tribes of Karag-Tor lived in constant war with one another, fighting over meagre resources in a tradition that valued killing skill above all else. Death was not feared. It was expected, embraced, even celebrated when earned in the arena. In such a place, mercy was an alien concept and pity was weakness. To grow to adulthood was to be sharpened like a blade, and to enter the trials for recruitment into the Steel Berserkers was to step into the forge that would either perfect the weapon or destroy it. The trials themselves were as much ritual as test. Aspirants were sent into the Iron Gauntlet, a wasteland of magnetic storms and roaming predator machines, remnants of an ancient Mechanicus outpost long since overrun. For 7 days they had to survive without aid, each kill marked into the metal tags they carried. Those who returned with fewer than 7 kills were cast into the molten pit, their bodies consumed as offerings to the Iron Spirits. Those who returned with more were taken into the Fortress Monastery, the Iron Bastion, a Cyclopean citadel built into the walls of a dormant volcano. There they were broken and remade in the image of the Astartes, their flesh enhanced, their minds reforged. But unlike other chapters, the psycho-indoctrination of the Steel Berserkers did not suppress aggression. It nurtured it, shaping it into a controlled burn that could, at need, flare into an all-consuming blaze. Yet that control was always fragile. Even in these early years, chaplains found themselves not preaching discipline, but directing the flame, reminding their brothers who the enemy was and ensuring that enemy was annihilated before the fire turned inward. For when the Steel Berserkers had no foe before them, their restlessness turned to suspicion, to challenge, to the settling of imagined slights through trial by combat. Duels within the chapter were common, often lethal, and seen not as breaches of discipline but as a necessary culling. This doctrine, alien to the Codex, was tolerated because it kept their fury honed, and because their battlefield record left little room for reprimand. It is tempting to see in them the shadow of the World Eaters' Legion, broken by the butcher's nails and driven into cornity worship. Certainly the comparison is often made by their detractors, and not without cause. But to equate the two is to miss the subtlety, such as it is, of the Berserkers' design. They are not madmen chained to rage. They are predators who have learned to choose when to strike with frenzy, and when to hold it back, if only barely. This choice is their salvation, and perhaps the only thing keeping them from damnation. But choice can be eroded. Choice can be worn away by blood. Whispers of instability began to circulate as early as their 2nd century of service. Apothecaries reported increased instances of battle brothers entering fugue states during prolonged combat, emerging hours later unable to recall their actions. Some claimed this was battle trance, the Emperor's guidance in war. Others saw it as the first sign of something darker, a genetic flaw flowering at last. The chapter's leadership, such as it was, ignored these warnings. They had been made for war, and war was all they knew. What mattered if their fury grew sharper with time, so long as their enemies died beneath it? And so they were unleashed again and again, sent to the war zones others could not, or would not hold. They fought amidst the frozen carcass cities of Arkush 7, against tyrannid vanguard organisms, their chain blades roaring even in sub-zero storms. They shattered the chaos warband known as the Ebonmaw on the streets of Branthium Prime, pursuing the last traitor marines into the Underhive and executing them before the screaming masses. They boarded Orkkill cruisers in mid-warp translation, slaughtering their crews before the Greenskins even realized they were under attack. Everywhere they went, the pattern repeated: total victory, high collateral loss, and a lingering unease among their allies. In time, they ceased to be called in for campaigns requiring subtlety or cooperation. They became the Imperium's firestorm, called only when the cost of unleashing them was outweighed by the cost of losing entirely. It is a dangerous thing to be valued only for destruction. It shapes how you see yourself. It shapes what you become. And for the Steel Berserkers, it was the beginning of a truth they would never escape. They were not defenders, they were executioners. Yet even an executioner must face judgment. For in the far reaches of the Imperium, where records are poor and the cries of the dying often go unheard, there are acts that even the High Lords cannot ignore forever. And in the dark archives of the Inquisition, the name Steel Berserkers began to appear in reports with unsettling frequency, alongside phrases such as indiscriminate force, uncontrolled aggression, and potential contamination. For the moment, the reports gathered dust, but dust does not bury a blade. It only hides it until the light reveals the edge once more. The question was never whether the Steel Berserkers would burn too hot. The question was only how much of the galaxy they would take with them when they did. The creation of the Steel Berserkers was never meant to be celebrated. There was no parade on terror, no proclamation in the halls of the Senatorum. Their founding was carried out in shadow, a reluctant experiment hidden in the ledger of imperial military expansion. In those days, the Imperium was reeling from wars too numerous to list. Hive fleets carving great wounds in the galactic rim, orc ways boiling over across entire sectors, heretical uprisings burning like fever through the heart of Segmentum Solar. The request for a new chapter was not born of foresight, but desperation. And desperation makes strange bargains. To create a chapter is to gamble with the Emperor's own work. The gene seed, the holy genetic legacy of the Primarchs, is a thing both sacred and volatile. Each founding is constrained by the long shadow of the Codex Astartes and by the iron laws of the Adeptus Mechanicus, who guard the vaults of gene stock as if they were relics of the Omnissiah himself. But in the deep halls of Mars there are vaults rarely spoken of, where gene lines deemed unstable are locked away. Some are cursed by mutation, others by flaws too dangerous to replicate. These vaults are meant never to be opened. Meant. The seed chosen for the Steel Berserkers was drawn from such a vault. Officially, the records name it as a derivation of an ultramarine line, altered for combat endurance optimization. In truth, that description was a mask for something else, something older, bloodier, more dangerous. Among the gene law adepts, whispers spoke of its kinship to the 12th Legion, the World Eaters, whose descent into madness during the Horus Heresy had nearly shattered the galaxy. Yet this was no direct copy. The flaw that had doomed Angron's sons was refined, contained, weaponized. The nails had been replaced by something subtler, not a machine in the skull, but an instinct in the blood, a compulsion sharpened over generations. It would not seize the mind without warning. It would offer the bearer a choice. But choice, as the Mechanicus knew, is a frail dam against the flood of war. It is said that the Magi overseeing the project called it the Ferrum Sanguinis Protocol, the forging of steel from blood. Their task was to make warriors who could fight longer, harder, and with greater savagery than any Codex-compliant chapter, without falling immediately into the madness of the 12th. The balance was precise, dangerous, and perhaps impossible. To ensure success, the Mechanicus insisted on overseeing the implantation process personally. Skitari cohorts and Magos biology were dispatched to Karagtor to build the facilities that would become the Iron Bastion. The Forge World priests did not trust the process to mere apothecaries. They sought to shape the new chapter not just in flesh, but in machine logic precision. From the start, there was tension. The chosen officers for the new chapter, drawn from veteran cadres of multiple parent chapters, bristled under the Mechanicus' constant oversight. The Mechanicus in turn viewed these veterans as necessary tools, not leaders. In the end, command was granted to one of the most relentless of these veterans, Brother Captain Garen Vorsk of the Carcharodon's Astra. Vorsk was a warrior whose name was spoken with respect in the void-faring fleets of the Segmentum Pacificus, a master of boarding actions, attrition sieges, and rapid extermination campaigns. He was not known for subtlety nor mercy. It was said he had never once ordered a retreat. He was the perfect commander for a force built on endurance and savagery. Vorsk's acceptance of command was conditional. He demanded complete authority over battlefield deployment and tactical doctrine. The Mechanicus could keep their laboratories and genetic protocols, but once his warriors were loosed, they would answer to him alone. The Magi agreed, perhaps believing that no commander, however stubborn, could long resist their control once the chapter was operational. They underestimated Vorsk. The earliest years of the Steel Berserkers were consumed with proving themselves fit for service. Founding a chapter is not a matter of simply handing warriors their armour and bidding them fight. Trials must be endured. Oaths must be sworn to the Adeptus Terra. Gene seed must be tested in combat conditions to ensure it will not fail in the crucible of war. These proving campaigns were carefully chosen, worlds on the edge of Imperial space, too far for the eyes of more scrupulous chapters, but infested with enemies that would push the Berserkers to their limits. One such proving ground was the Purge of Caravon Reach. Caravon was a barren asteroid belt orbiting a dead star, home only to mining colonies and the pirates who preyed upon them. At least, that was the surface truth. In reality, Caravon was infested with a splinter of the Tyrannid hive fleet Kraken, vanguard organisms that had adapted to the cold, airless void. The Steel Berserkers' mission was to scour the infestation before it could signal the greater swarm. Vorsk led the assault personally, deploying his new chapter in a series of precision void-boarding strikes. But precision in Berserker terms meant something else entirely. Boarding torpedoes slammed into infested hulks, disgorging squads of Astartes who waded into the chitinous masses with chain axes roaring, their bolters used as bludgeons when ammunition ran dry. Whole bioships were torn apart from within, their synaptic beasts hacked down in showers of ichor. The Mechanicus observers recorded victory in every engagement, but noted too the Berserkers' tendency to overcommit, to pursue kills deep into structurally unstable zones, even at the cost of their own lives. It was during these trials that the first signs of their flaw emerged. Apothecaries reported that in the heat of battle, some brothers entered states of heightened aggression far beyond normal combat arousal, a fugue in which pain, fatigue, and even injury were ignored entirely. This allowed them to fight far past endurance, but also made them heedless to command or danger. Vorsk did not see this as a flaw. He saw it as an advantage. A blade does not argue with the hand that swings it, he was recorded as saying. So long as it cuts true, it is sharp enough. The High Lords, receiving reports of the Berserkers' victories, approved their formal entry into the rolls of the Adeptus Astartes. There was no ceremony. The writ of recognition was transmitted through astropathic channels, sealed with the sigil of the Senatorum Imperialis. The Steel Berserkers were given their first independent war mandate, the pacification of the Golgothan Belt, a sector overrun by an Orc war of unprecedented scale. It was the perfect test. It was also, though, none realized it then, the first step toward their infamy. In the Golgothan campaigns, the Berserkers fought as if unleashed from a chain. Drop-pod assaults became orbital legends, steel coffins hurtling through fire and flak to slam into the heart of Orc fortresses, disgorging squads that hacked and tore through greenskin mobs with animal ferocity. Unlike most chapters, they did not favour protracted suppression or siegecraft. They sought the largest concentration of enemies, struck it like a hammer blow and broke it utterly. Orc warlords, who thrived on direct combat, found themselves undone by the sheer relentlessness of their attackers. Berserker squads fought until the ground itself was slick with blood, then pushed on, leaving the dead in steaming heaps behind them. Yet these victories carried a cost not measured in bodies alone. Imperial Guard regiments deployed alongside the Berserkers began filing unofficial complaints, accounts of friendly casualties caused by indiscriminate fire, of guardsmen trampled in the fury of charges, of civilians executed without orders. Commanders learned quickly that to deploy with the Berserkers was to surrender the field to them entirely. Once battle began, there was no cooperation, only survival in the wake of their advance. Vorsk dismissed these reports. To him, the measure of a campaign was in its end result, not in the state of its allies. The Golgothan War was shattered, the belt was pacified, the Imperium's enemies lay dead. What more was required? But in the depths of the Order Hereticus archives, a thin file was opened. Its title was simple: Observations on the Steel Berserkers, Potential Threat Classification. It would not be the last such file. By the end of their first century, the Steel Berserkers had earned a reputation that was both a blessing and a curse. When the Imperium needed a war zone ended, they were called. When subtlety, diplomacy, or cooperation were required, they were avoided. They were given the most dangerous assignments, and in surviving them, became ever more convinced of their own invincibility. In their halls on Karagtor, war trophies from every corner of the galaxy hung like grisly banners. Tyrannid skulls bleached by void exposure, orc banners stiff with dried blood, chaos helms split and blackened by promethium flame. To the berserkers these were marks of honour. To others they were warnings, and always, beneath the glory, the flaw deepened. Gene seed analysis grew increasingly irregular. Apothecaries began to see traits manifest earlier in new recruits: heightened aggression during training duels, difficulty in ceasing combat even after victory was assured, and in some cases muttered recollections of dreams filled with blood and steel. The Mechanicus requested additional oversight. Vorsk refused. The chapter was his, and his alone. It was a dangerous truth that would in time demand its price, for no fire can be fed endlessly without consuming its own hearth, and the Steel Berserkers were a fire without equal. Karagtor was never a world meant for peace. Long before it was chosen as the Steel Berserkers' home, it had been catalogued by Imperial surveyors as a marginal death world, its value lying not in its resources but in the sheer hardness of those few humans who survived upon its surface. It orbited close to its dying red sun, a star swollen and sullen in its age, casting the land in an endless twilight of rust and blood. The planet's crust was unstable, its tectonic plates grinding against one another in constant violent spasms. Volcanoes bled rivers of molten ore across plains of jagged basalt. The skies were a constant churn of ash storms and metallic dust, charged with static lightning that could flay a man's flesh to the bone. The seas, if they could be called such, were pools of heavy, mineral-thick slurry, heated by volcanic vents until they boiled. Life here had adapted not by gentleness but by aggression. Everything that crawled, flew, or swam was armed with fangs, talons, or barbed hide. When the Imperium first brought compliance to Karagtor, it did so not through negotiation, but by burning 1/3 of its inhabited zones from orbit. The tribes that remained were those too stubborn to submit and too vicious to be exterminated. They fought each other as readily as they had fought the invaders, and though the Imperial Aquila was raised above their cities of blackened steel and stone, it was a hollow claim. For centuries after compliance, the administratum avoided interference. The tithe was paid in ore, in weapons-grade metals, and in the bodies of condemned criminals for the penal legions, and that was enough. The Mechanicus first marked the world during the early planning for the Steel Berserkers' founding. Its endless iron veins, its natural crucible of hardship, and its population's ingrained warrior culture made it an ideal recruitment ground. To forge a chapter intended for savage endurance, the forge itself had to be savage. Here, the would-be Astartes would be tempered in a way no artificial trial could match. On most recruitment worlds, aspirants were children selected for their physical potential, then shaped into warriors. On Karagtor, they were warriors before they could even speak. Blooded in the pit fights of their tribes, learning to kill for food and for status long before they learned to read. From the moment the Steel Berserkers claimed the world, the culture of Karagtor became inextricable from the chapter itself. Each tribe sought to prove itself the most worthy, offering its best fighters as aspirants. But the Berserkers did not take the strongest. Strength without endurance was nothing. Skill without ferocity was weakness, and so they devised the Iron Gauntlet. The Iron Gauntlet began at the gates of the Iron Bastion, the fortress monastery carved directly into the sheer walls of Mount Dravok, a dormant volcano whose heart served as both forge and sanctuary. From those gates, aspirants were driven into the ash wastes, stripped of armour, given only a blade and the steel tags they wore around their necks. For 7 days they had to survive in a land where the air burned in the lungs, where iron storms could peel the flesh from bone, and where predator machines, half-feral war constructs from some forgotten Mechanicus facility, roamed alongside the native beasts. Each kill had to be marked into the steel tag, a jagged cut for each victory. The gauntlet was not merely a test of combat, but of will. Storms could rage for days without pause. Water could be found only in the boiling pools at the edges of lava flows, drinkable only if filtered through layers of ash. The predators were relentless. Scaled drakes that could crush a man in their jaws, packs of ironclad hounds whose teeth could pierce plasteel, and the dreaded Ferrum Wraiths, semi-autonomous constructs that hunted heat signatures in the storms. Those who returned with fewer than 7 marks on their tag were cast into the molten pit, a ceremonial chute that plunged straight into the lava heart of Mount Dravok. Their screams echoed up the basalt walls as their flesh was consumed, offered as tribute to the so-called Iron Spirits, an ancient superstition the chapter allowed to endure. Those who returned with 7 or more were taken inside the Iron Bastion, where they began the long, agonizing process of becoming Astartes. The bastion itself was a city of iron and fire. Great chains hung from the vaulted ceilings of its forge halls, suspending the half-built shells of land raiders and dreadnought sarcophagi. The air was thick with incense and the tang of scorched metal. Tech marines moved through the halls like priests in a temple, chanting Benharic litanies to the Omnissiah as they worked. Chaplains preached from pulpits carved into the walls, their words echoing over the clang of hammers. The smell of blood and oil was ever present, for in the Steel Berserkers' creed, the two were one. Aspirants who survived implantation entered a new phase of trial, not the suppression of rage as in other chapters, but the control of its release. They were taught to fight at the edge of frenzy, to let the heat of battle fuel their strikes without surrendering entirely to it, at least at first. Their tutors, many of them veterans of Karagtor's own tribes, understood that the fire could not be extinguished without dulling the blade. Instead, it was banked, stoked, and unleashed with precision. In the arenas of the bastion, aspirants fought not only each other, but captured Xenos, condemned criminals, and even cybernetic war beasts built for the purpose. Death in these trials was frequent, accepted, even celebrated as part of the winnowing process. Karagtor's influence on the chapter extended beyond recruitment. Its warrior tribes had their own traditions, the wearing of trophies taken from slain foes, the forging of weapons as personal talismans, the marking of flesh with scars in patterns that told a warrior's history. These customs bled into the Berserkers' culture until they were inseparable. Chain weapons were favoured not just for their killing power, but for the visceral sound and spray they produced, proof of a kill that could be seen and heard by all nearby. Armour was customised with spikes, serrations, and brutal angular motifs meant to evoke the volcanic ridges of their home. Even their war cries were drawn from the tongue of Karagtor, a guttural grinding language that sounded as much like the shifting of rock and metal as human speech. To hear a Berserker company charge in full voice was to hear an avalanche of steel crashing down. Life on Karagtor was unchanging. The volcanoes rumbled, the ash fell, the tribes fought, and the bastion loomed eternal above it all. This constancy was both strength and weakness. It created warriors who could endure anything, but it also forged a mindset in which the galaxy was simply a larger Karagtor, an endless series of trials in which mercy was meaningless and survival was the only law. When Berserkers deployed to other worlds, they brought this worldview with them. Civilian populations were treated as potential enemies until proven otherwise. Alliances were temporary conveniences. Honour was measured not in promises kept, but in enemies slain. The Imperium's officials stationed on Karagtor learned quickly to stay out of the chapter's internal affairs. The Administratum collected its tithes from the mining guilds in the shadow of the bastion's walls and departed as quickly as possible. Even the Ecclesiarchy, so often eager to cement its influence, found little purchase here. The Berserkers respected the Emperor, but in the way a weapon respects the hand that wields it, as an abstract force of purpose, not as an object of worship. Their chaplains preached of him as the first warrior, the Iron Father of mankind, whose gift was the fury to stand against the night. Sermons on mercy or forgiveness found no echo in the echoing halls of the bastion. The world itself seemed to conspire in keeping the chapter apart from the rest of the Imperium. Warp storms were common in the system's outer reaches, delaying or entirely preventing travel for months at a time. Many Imperial officials came to see this isolation as a blessing, a natural buffer between the galaxy and the chapter's most dangerous traits. But isolation also meant that the Berserkers' nature went largely unchecked. In their own realm, they could train, fight, and shape themselves without interference. By the time a century had passed since their founding, the Steel Berserkers were less a product of the Codex Astartes and more the children of Karagtor, bound by the laws of iron, fire, and blood. And yet, for all their savagery, there was a grim kind of honour in their way. On Karagtor, a warrior never turned from a challenge. Duels were fought to the death not out of cruelty, but because only death could prove a warrior's worth beyond question. A berserker would rather die than flee. To abandon a battle was to abandon oneself. This creed made them fearsome beyond compare on the battlefield, and utterly inflexible in the face of changing circumstances. It was this inflexibility that would one day lead them into wars they could not win, and to stands from which they would not retreat. But for now, Karagtor was their anvil, and they were the hammers striking themselves into the weapons they believed the Emperor desired. Each war they fought, each kill they claimed, was another blow in the forge. And in the forge of Karagtor, steel was not tempered for beauty, it was tempered to kill. The galaxy, for all its infinite sprawl and boundless darkness, has a strange way of remembering those who rise in blood. For the Steel Berserkers, their ascent from a brutalized brotherhood of survivors to a name uttered in dread across entire subsectors did not occur in the whispered corridors of imperial bureaucracy, nor in the slow accumulation of centuries-long honor rolls. It was forged in the heat of unrelenting conflict, upon the carcasses of worlds that would never again know peace. By the close of the third founding 2nd century, they had already shed the anonymity of their first decades. The crimson mark of their campaigns, the burning icon of their chapter sigil, overlaid with the jagged wreaths of victory, was known to orc warlords, to chaos lords, to pirate princes and heretical cult masters alike, and in that knowing came fear. The ascension began on Carthan's Reach, a half-dead mining world trapped in the cyclonic embrace of an unstable star. The planet's sole value lay in its deep crust deposits of ferrophage ore, the kind that could eat lesser forging tools but which, once mastered, could feed the titanic industries of Segmentum Solar. For decades the Reach had been left to its own slow demise, its loyal but forgotten imperial citizens toiling beneath a sky fractured by storms. That neglect made it ripe for invasion. An orc! Wah! Under war boss Scragga, Iron Skull descended upon the system with all the subtlety of a meteor strike. No astropathic call for aid was sent. The orcs destroyed the communications arrays before the first day's end. The Steel Berserkers did not arrive by imperial order. They came because the orcs' advance threatened one of their newly established forges in the neighbouring Targos belt. They came because to allow this infestation to root so close to their own holdings was unthinkable. And they came because here they saw a proving ground, a crucible where steel, both theirs and their enemies, would be tested to the breaking point. Their strike was surgical in plan but volcanic in execution. Thunderhawks dropped like fangs into the orc encampments, disgorging warriors whose ceramite plate glistened wet with the oily dust of Carthan's storms. The first wave slaughtered without hesitation, their chain blades roaring with a pitch that rose and fell like a predator's breath. The orcs, taken aback by the sudden ferocity, were forced into brutal melee before their heavier weapons could be brought to bear. It was in the week-long push from the mining fields to the planet's central bastion that the Steel Berserkers revealed their true character. They did not merely press an advantage, they ground it into the marrow of their enemy. Every full-back position was hounded to the last greenskin. Every flank was hammered not once but until it collapsed entirely. It was here that the infamous Talon March was first recorded, squads advancing in staggered waves, tearing through orc positions before fading into the dust storms, only to reappear from a different angle minutes later. Survivors, and there were few, spoke of fighting ghosts with steel bodies. By the campaign's end, Scragga Ironskull was dead, his head mounted upon the prow of the chapter's flagship, the Ferrum Invictus. Carthan's Reach was reclaimed, though its surface bore so many scars from orbital strikes and seismic charges that it would never fully recover. The Administratum declared the planet pacified, the Steel Berserkers declared it purified. The distinction was telling. Carthan's Reach was only the first of what Imperial historians would later call the Crimson Ascension, a sequence of victories across the fringe sectors of Segmentum Solar that saw the Steel Berserkers evolve from a localized force into a recognized, if unofficial, bulwark of Imperial might. Their campaigns followed a grim pattern: detect the threat before Imperial bureaucracy could respond, deploy with overwhelming force, annihilate the enemy root and branch, and move on before the ashes had cooled. It was a doctrine born of pragmatism but fed by something darker, an almost ritualistic need to dominate every theatre in which they set foot. Whispers began to circulate in certain inquisitorial circles. The Berserkers' methods, while undeniably effective, often left little distinction between the fate of the enemy and that of any civilians too slow or stubborn to flee the war zone. The chapter was not blind to such accusations. They simply did not care. In their creed, mercy was a currency that weakened both giver and receiver. To cleanse was to destroy utterly. To destroy utterly was to protect eternally. Not all of their ascension was bathed in orc blood. On the feudal world of Indros, the Berserkers faced a rebellion unlike any they had yet encountered. Human, disciplined and fortified in the traditions of ancient techno-feudal warfare. The Indrosi lords had been imperial tithe payers for centuries, but a schism in their ruling dynasty had plunged the world into a war that drew the attention of a rogue trader seeking to exploit the chaos. His name is lost to the void, for the Berserkers erased him and his forces with such thoroughness that even the Mechanicus record clerks could recover no trace. The war on Indros demonstrated another facet of the chapter's nature, their ability to turn an enemy's strengths against them. The Indrosi fielded Knight-class war engines, ancient relics whose machine spirits had fought in the Great Crusade. Against most Astarte's forces, such war machines could have held the field for weeks, if not months. Against the Steel Berserkers, they became little more than towering coffins. Veteran Devastator squads crippled the Knights' legs with concentrated melter fire, while assault contingents swarmed the grounded Titans to cut open their carapaces with adamantium saws. The psychological blow to the Indrosi nobility was total. By the campaign's end, the Berserkers had not only restored imperial compliance, but had also claimed 3 of the defeated knights as trophies, stripped of heraldry, repainted in the chapter's steel and crimson, and bound to their service in perpetuity. These war machines would march in future campaigns, symbols of the chapter's relentless will to appropriate the strength of their enemies. The Crimson Ascension reached its symbolic peak in the Battle of the Silent Halo, a void engagement against a chaos warband known as the Reapers of Vaith. The Reapers were a splinter of the Black Legion, their ships marked by jagged rune inscriptions that bled light into the void. Their incursion threatened a pilgrim convoy bound for the shrine world of Melchior's Gate, an easy target for any warband seeking to sow terror in the Imperium's faithful. The Steel Berserkers arrived before the convoy could be intercepted, their fleet dropping out of warp in a tight formation designed for immediate assault. The void battle that followed was as much ritual slaughter as tactical engagement. The Ferrum Invictus rammed the Reaper's flagship, the Pale Omen, at full burn, boarding torpedoes punching through her decks moments before the impact. Boarding actions raged across corridors lit by the flicker of dying power cores, the Berserkers fighting in near silence save for the thrum of their weapons. By the time the Pale Omen was scuttled, the Pilgrim convoy had escaped, and the Silent Halo, an asteroid belt so named for its radio-dead expanse, was littered with burning wreckage. The chapter's reputation was now cemented. They were no longer a name known only to the enemies they had defeated, but a force spoken of in the stratagems of Segmentum Command. Praise came reluctantly from some quarters, and warnings from others. The Ordos Hereticus, in particular, took note of their increasing disregard for collateral imperial losses. The Steel Berserkers responded to such censure with the same stance they took to all things. They neither apologized nor explained, yet even in triumph, shadows lengthened. The very ferocity that had brought them glory would, in time, draw them into conflicts where victory would come at greater cost than even they had foreseen. The Crimson Ascension had elevated them to the heights of renown, but from such heights the fall, when it came, would be catastrophic. And already, in the void beyond their borders, threats stirred, ancient, patient, and far less easily broken than any orc warlord or feudal tyrant. For the galaxy is vast, but it never forgets those who rise in blood, and the Steel Berserkers had risen far indeed. They were not like other chapters. Even in the age of the Imperium, when each Adeptus Astartes brotherhood bore its own customs, war cries, and ways of waging the Emperor's wars, the Steel Berserkers were set apart, not merely in temperament, but in the very architecture of their being. Their name was not a flourish of heraldry, nor a tale inherited from some ancient crusade. It was a sentence, a truth that ran through every sinew, every oath, every drop of engineered blood within their veins. To understand their savagery, one must understand the machine that birthed it. The first layer was the flesh, or what remained of it. Recruits taken into the Steel Berserkers did not simply endure the brutal gene seed implantation of the Astartes, they underwent the Berserker Reforge. It was an ordeal whispered of in Mechanicus' vaults, for it fused the artistry of the biologists with the cruelty of the Ordo Reductor's augmetic craft. Bone was reinforced with adamantine lattice, muscle fibre interwoven with micromyoma strands, and the nervous system etched with pain response limiters that could be switched off at will. The result was not just a space marine, but a predator who could run through fire and glass, whose broken limbs could still swing a chain axe with killing force, and whose heart would keep beating long after the body had taken wounds fatal to others. But flesh alone was insufficient. The second layer was their creed. Where other chapters recited the Codex Astartes as scripture, or adapted it to suit their warlike heritage, the Steel Berserkers treated it as a springboard into excess. Guilliman's tactical wisdom was not abandoned, but it was tempered, sharpened, by an ethos that placed shock assault above all else. Wars were not to be endured, they were to be ended abruptly and absolutely with overwhelming violence. In the chapter's war count there was no word for protracted engagement, only for storm, breach, and slaughter. In their battle sermons, chaplains would speak not of the patient trap, but of the moment when the foe's spirit cracked beneath the hammer blow. The Berserkers sought that moment as a zealot seeks revelation. The third layer was their structure, and here too they diverged from the norm. Their companies, though nominally 10 in number, were not equal in function. 3 were designated anvil companies, heavily armed formations whose sole task was to pin and bleed the enemy. Line. 4 were blade companies, mobile, ravening strike forces designed to penetrate and decapitate. The remaining 3 were iron fang companies, their most feared composed entirely of assault specialists clad in modified Terminator plate. In campaigns where the Steel Berserkers fought as a whole chapter, rare though such events were, the Iron Fangs would descend like living meteors, breaking the enemy's back before the rest of the force could even engage. Technology was the 4th layer, and perhaps the most controversial. The Steel Berserkers did not merely maintain their war gear, they altered it. Chain blades were retoothed with monomolecular adamant teeth. Power armor was retrofitted with additional reinforcement plates and heat dispersal vents for sustained melee carnage. Their tech marines, known within the chapter as Steelrights, carried designs that the Adeptus Mechanicus had long declared forbidden, claiming they were derived from Dark Age patterns whose provenance was questionable. Whispered rumours in the Forge world spoke of the Steel Berserkers' vaults, holding relics of cybernetic integration older than the Imperium itself. And yet, for all the grumbling of Martian priests, the chapter's armoury remained stocked and blessed, for none could deny their results. Philosophy was the final layer, and the one least understood by outsiders. For all their brutality, the Steel Berserkers were not mindless. Their fury was honed, their violence purposeful. They believed the galaxy could not be tamed by reason or pacified by fear alone. It had to be broken. To them, each campaign was a crucible in which the weak would burn away, leaving only the hardened will to serve the Emperor's eternal war. Mercy, in their eyes, was not kindness, but corruption. The rot that spread when one spared a foe who might one day rise again. Their chaplains' catechisms were filled with iron maxims. Strike so no blow need be struck twice. Leave nothing that may fester. To falter is to invite ruin. There was, however, an undercurrent of something darker. A refrain that surfaced in their war prayers, in their quiet rites before battle, even in the death oaths sworn over the fallen. They called it the Pact of the Anvil, a promise between warrior and war. Once forged, it could never be broken, for it was not sworn to the Emperor, nor to their chapter master, nor to mankind. It was sworn to the act of battle itself, as if war was a living thing to which they owed allegiance. Whether this was mere metaphor, a cultural quirk born of millennia of ceaseless combat, or something more. Troubling, none could say. But those who fought beside the Steel Berserkers sometimes whispered of how they moved, not like men driven to war, but like men called to it. The combination of these 5 layers, flesh, creed, structure, technology, and philosophy, forged a war machine unlike any other in the Imperium. A chapter that did not merely kill its enemies, but unmade them, And yet this perfection came at a cost. For every battle they won, the Berserkers seemed to lose some part of what the Codex deemed balance. Their campaigns grew shorter but bloodier, their diplomacy more strained, their patience for imperial bureaucracy all but non-existent. Their demands for resources, munitions, and replacement war gear strained supply lines, forcing the Munitorum to make hard choices, and inevitably, enemies. This did not trouble them. In the eyes of the Steel Berserkers, enemies were the natural state of the galaxy. Allies were temporary conveniences, foes were eternal truths, and so, as their victories mounted, so too did their isolation. The High Lords tolerated them because they needed them. The Inquisition watched them because it feared them. The Mechanicus armed them because it could not deny their results. But in the shadows, the seeds of suspicion began to sprout, for the Berserkers' technology was not the only thing the Mechanicus whispered about. There were rumours, always rumours, of certain recruits vanishing during the Reforge, of warriors returning from the anvil of augmentation with eyes that glowed faintly in the dark, or with voices that resonated oddly, as if carrying a mechanical undertone. The chapter dismissed these as battlefield myths, born of fear and awe. But in the vaults of Mars, some among the Magi began to wonder whether the Steel Berserkers had altered more than armour and weaponry, whether their very gene seed had been touched by some alien forbidden hand. And yet the Berserkers endured. Their enemies fell, their forges burned hot, and their creed only deepened. The galaxy was full of chapters that fought for honour, for the Emperor, for their homeworlds. The Steel Berserkers fought for the act of destruction itself, and in doing so they carved their name into the ledger of history with every stroke of their chain axes. But nothing forged in such fire can remain unchallenged forever. The very traits that made them so feared would soon draw the gaze of powers both within and beyond the Imperium, and when that gaze fell upon them, the question would no longer be whether the Steel Berserkers could win, but whether they could endure. The long years of conquest had forged the Steel Berserkers into a weapon of unparalleled brutality, a blade honed in the blood of countless foes and tempered in the furnace of endless war. But like any blade drawn too often, its edge began to wear, its steel to weaken, not from without, but from within. In the grim darkness of the far future, even the mightiest warrior brotherhoods find that the enemy most lethal to them is not alien nor heretic, but themselves. And so it was that the first cracks in the Berserkers' iron resolve began to form, hairline fractures spreading unseen beneath the lacquer of victory. It began, as such things often do, with silence. The silence of brothers who once roared together in the din of battle, now choosing their words carefully, their glances tighter, their loyalties shifting in unseen ways. The campaigns in the eastern fringe had been brutal beyond measure. The worlds they took were worlds not worth keeping, ashes and rubble, people broken beyond repair. The Berserkers had fought like rabid beasts in those theatres, stripping themselves down to pure instinct to survive. When they returned to their bastion fortresses, they carried that raw savagery home like a contagion. Training duels became more lethal. Accidents left warriors dead on the sparring grounds. The apothecaries whispered of unusual psychological strain, battle rage that no longer subsided, warriors unable to shed the fight from their bones even in the stillness of night. The chapter's leadership, still under the stern hand of High Warlord Carvis, believed the problem lay in discipline. His solution was simple and brutal. More war. War as purification. War as the whetstone to grind away unworthy metal. The Berserkers were hurled into fresh campaigns, each more punishing than the last. For a time, it worked. Victories were won, honours accrued, foes annihilated so utterly that Imperial commanders began to look upon the chapter with a mix of awe and unease. But the cost was mounting. Casualty rates climbed beyond sustainable levels, gene seed loss reached alarming thresholds, and whispers began among the chaplains of something deeper, something festering in the spiritual marrow of the chapter. The first open rupture came on the forge world of Brakath 9. Tasked with purging a chaos incursion that had taken root in the Manufactoria levels, the Berserkers split into strike cadres to drive the heretics into the central furnaces. The plan was elegant, precise, at least until Captain Vardrus of the Third Claw ignored his orders and plunged headlong into the most fortified sector, dragging his warriors into a brutal week-long slaughter from which only a handful returned. His disobedience had secured the death of the heretic magister, but at the cost of delaying the campaign by critical days and spilling unnecessary oceans of blood. Carves's response was swift. Vardrus was publicly stripped of his honours, his warplate ritually scarred to mark his disgrace. But the damage was done. The Third Claw saw their captain's act not as folly but as heroism. Quietly they began to question why a warrior's glory should be shackled by command. This seed of dissent took root in strange soil. The Steel Berserkers had always revered individual ferocity, but it had always been tempered by the iron bond of the pack. Now that bond frayed. Duels over matters of honour became common. Kill tallies were kept with obsessive precision. Entire squads operated as though competing in some unspoken contest for supremacy. Some said this was simply the chapter's nature blooming to its fullest. After all, they were named Berserkers for a reason. Others, more cautious, saw the dangerous truth. A chapter divided into hungry predators was no chapter at all. The chaplains preached unity from the pulpits, their words ringing through the echoing vaults of the fortress monastery. They spoke of the Emperor's will, of the necessity of the pack over the lone wolf, of the shame of selfish glory. But even their sermons grew sharper, more accusatory, and in their zeal they began to favour those who displayed fanatical obedience over those whose independent streak made them difficult to control. Warriors once lauded for their cunning began to find themselves sidelined in key campaigns, their talents wasted in token engagements. Resentment festered, and into this volatile atmosphere stepped the enemy that would push them to the brink. Not a Xenos host, not a heretic legion, but a foe of the mind. The Eldar Corsair fleet known as the Shattered Prism began raiding along the Berserkers' patrol routes, striking like shadows, retreating before they could be pinned. They targeted supply convoys, stranded Berserker strike forces on dead worlds, and left mocking glyphs carved into the hulls of captured ships. The Corsairs understood the Berserkers better than most. They knew the chapter's lust for a decisive, crushing victory, and they denied them that at every turn. Engagements were brief, frustrating, infuriating. Days turned into weeks, and the Berserkers grew ever more reckless in their attempts to force battle. In this frustration, the simmering tensions within the chapter boiled over. On the fractured moon of Soulless Morn, two companies collided, not with the Corsairs, but with each other. Disagreements over pursuit routes escalated into accusations of cowardice and sabotage. Bolters were raised, blood was spilled. By the time the chaplains intervened, 9 brothers lay dead by the hands of their own kin. The Corsairs, opportunistic as ever, struck during the chaos, slaughtering the wounded and looting the battlefield before vanishing into the webway. The shame of that day would never leave the Berserkers, but it did not heal them. It only deepened the divisions. Carves knew something had to change, yet his own instincts betrayed him. He had risen through the ranks by being the most relentless, the most unyielding, the most willing to bleed for every inch of ground. To him, compromise was weakness, diplomacy a poison. He doubled down on his creed: harder campaigns, harsher punishments, absolute obedience. To those loyal to him, he was a rock in the storm. To those who had begun to question, he was a tyrant clinging to power through fear. The schism was no longer hidden. It was visible in every war council, every campaign, every clash of armoured forms in the practice cages. And then came the campaign that would push the chapter past the point of no return: the Red Wake. The imperial world of Harrowdeep, besieged by a vast orc wah, sent desperate calls for aid. The Berserkers responded in full force, seeing in it a chance to unify through shared battle. The fighting was apocalyptic, streets choked with rubble, air black with soot and spores, the ground shaking under the weight of orc gargants. For a time, the Berserkers fought as they once had, shoulder to shoulder, slaughtering the greenskins in their thousands. But as the war dragged on, resources dwindled, and command decisions became matters of life and death. When Carves ordered a retreat from the southern districts to consolidate lines, Captain Jarath of the 7th Claw refused, holding his ground against orders. His stand became legend: 30 warriors holding back an orc tide for 3 days without reinforcement. But it also cost the lives of hundreds of guardsmen cut off from evacuation. In the aftermath, Carves demanded Jorath's death for insubordination. The seventh claw refused, and for the first time in the chapter's history, a company stood openly against the High Warlord. Only the immediate threat of the Orcs prevented open battle between Berserkers. By the time Harrowdeep was saved, the damage was irreparable. The Steel Berserkers were no longer a single, unbreakable blade. They were shards, sharp and deadly, but turning on each other as often as they struck the enemy. And yet, for all the blood spilled and trust broken, the Berserkers remained outwardly formidable. To the wider Imperium, they were still the savage, relentless, unforgiving sons of iron who had broken worlds beneath their boots. But those who knew the chapter well saw the truth, that the iron was rusting, the steel bending under invisible strain, the fractures had formed. It was only a matter of time before they became breaks, and in the shadows beyond the light of the Astronomicon, darker forces had begun to take notice of the Steel Berserkers' faltering unity. Forces that knew how to turn brother against brother until nothing remained but ashes. The storm was coming. The breaking storm did not arrive with fanfare. It came as a whisper, a dark tide creeping silently across the fractured fabric of the Steel Berserkers. By the time it roared through their ranks, it had already unmade the foundation upon which the chapter had built its savage legacy. The war-weary cries of brothers lost to infighting and despair echoed across the fortress monastery, yet none could have foreseen the true tempest lying in wait beyond the veil of stars. The Ordo Hereticus, long watching the Berserkers with wary eyes, had grown restless. Reports of unorthodox augmentations, whispered heresies, and the strange rituals of the Pact of the Anvil had stirred them to investigate. But this was not a matter easily handled by polite inquiry or subtle observation. The Steel Berserkers were no ordinary chapter. They were a tempest incarnate, unyielding, brutal, and suspicious of any attempt to pry into their affairs. The Inquisitors sent to the chapter soon found themselves caught in a web of silence and hostility. No secrets were willingly shared, no sin was confessed. Only steel and blood spoke in the echoing halls, yet beneath the veneer of unity, chaos churned. Some within the chapter welcomed the scrutiny, seeing it as a chance to cleanse their inner rot. Others resisted fiercely, viewing it as an affront to their sacred oaths and hard-won traditions. The fault lines deepened. Trust broke down further. When an inquisitorial strike force arrived under the cover of darkness to confiscate what they termed corrupted relics and forbidden tech, the Steel Berserkers responded with an unforgiving ferocity that left more than one Inquisitor dead in the dust of a shattered hangar. The event was hushed quickly, classified under the strictest seals, but it was the first blood spilled in what would become a civil war within a brotherhood. The strain proved too great for High Warlord Carves. The weight of command bore down upon him like the crushing anvils of his chapter's forge, and cracks appeared in the once unshakable leader. Some claimed he began to exhibit signs of instability, brooding in silence, brooking no dissent, and driving his warriors harder into the fires of battle to stave off his own demons. His visions, if indeed they were more than whispered rumour, spoke of darkness clawing at the chapter's soul, of a storm that would burn the very essence of their being. It was during the campaign on the shattered world of Theraxis that the storm broke. The planet itself was a ruin, shattered by warp storms and long abandoned by Imperial surveyors. But it was home to a splintered cult of the Dark Mechanicum, whose twisted devices and cursed machines had long threatened the security of the neighbouring systems. The Steel Berserkers were dispatched to cleanse this threat with surgical precision. But Theraxis was a crucible unlike any before. The cultists had twisted the very technology the Berserkers relied upon, creating abominable war machines that melded flesh, metal, and warp-tainted sorcery. The battles fought in the ruined Manufactoria were brutal beyond reckoning. Corridors choked with smoke, echoing with the screams of the dying, the clash of chain blades against corrupted servitors. Here the Berserkers faced foes that reflected their own nature, machines born of rage and steel, twisted into something unholy. Amid the chaos, betrayal erupted. An entire company, the Fifth Iron Fang, was discovered to have been infiltrated by cultists loyal to the Dark Mechanicum. Their corruption ran deep. Secret rituals, whispered blasphemies, and unholy rites performed beneath the moonless skies. The revelation shattered the chapter's already fragile trust. Brothers hunted brothers. Blood stained the blood-stained floors anew. The fifth Iron Fang was purged in a campaign that left the planet a graveyard of bones and fire, but the damage was done. The chapter was no longer a single entity. It was fractured, fragmented, consumed by suspicion and rage. The High Warlord's command was openly challenged. Several captains formed factions, each seeking control through force or cunning. The fortress monastery became a battleground of politics and vengeance, its ancient halls ringing not just with the prayers to the Emperor, but with the clash of steel in midnight duels. The Adeptus Mechanicus, horrified at the revelations of corruption and forbidden technology, began withdrawing support. Supply lines slowed, the flow of rare materials was restricted, and the Berserkers' tech marines found themselves isolated from the wider network of knowledge and aid. To the wider Imperium, the Steel Berserkers were a contagion, a festering wound in the body of the Emperor's forces. Yet still they fought. Still they bled. Still they sought to burn away their enemies with fire and fury. The climax of this internal war came on the day known among the surviving Berserkers as the Night of Shattered Oaths. A conspiracy aimed at overthrowing Carves culminated in open battle within the fortress itself. The halls were transformed into a labyrinth of death and madness. Brother fought brother beneath the statues of the Emperor. Relics of the chapter were smashed. Blood flowed like rivers through the ancient stone. Carves himself fell in the final duel, his body broken but his will unyielding until the last breath. His death did not end the fighting, it only deepened the chaos. A new High Warlord would rise, but he would inherit a chapter fractured beyond repair. This turning point was not just a battle lost or won, it was a transformation. The Steel Berserkers ceased to be a single brotherhood. They became a collection of warbands, each vying for supremacy, each driven by their own interpretation of the ancient pact they had sworn. The very essence of their identity was in flux, threatened by the dual forces of external hostility and internal decay. Yet, in the endless war of the galaxy, survival is victory, and the Berserkers survived. Their legend darkened but endured. Their fury was no longer a unified storm but a fractured tempest, unpredictable, dangerous, and terrifying in its new form. As the dust settled, whispers began anew, of ancient evils awakened, of secrets buried beneath the ruins of Theraxis, of a darkness that had claimed not just flesh and bone, but the soul of the Steel Berserkers themselves. The storm had broken, and the true war for the chapter's soul was only beginning. The shattering of the Steel Berserkers was not a silent event, nor one contained within the stone walls of their fortress monastery. The echoes of their collapse rippled outward, shaking the precarious balance of power in the sectors they once controlled with iron will. Where once the name Steel Berserkers had inspired terror and reluctant respect, now it carried a different weight, one of fractured menace, unpredictable violence, and whispered dread. Their fractured warbands scattered across contested worlds and war-torn frontiers, each carrying fragments of the chapter's once unified doctrine twisted by their own ambitions and scars. These warbands fought not only the enemies of the Imperium, but increasingly one another, turning battlefields into arenas of bitter rivalry as much as holy war. The wider Imperium, strained by countless conflicts, took wary note. No longer could the Berserkers be wielded as a single blade to cut down foes. They had become fractured shards, each sharp and dangerous, but lacking the cohesion that had once made them unstoppable. This fracturing played directly into the hands of the enemies watching from the shadows. The Chaos Forces, ever hungry for discord among the Emperor's warriors, sought to exploit the Berserkers' disunity. On the forsaken world of Drethos, the most infamous of these warbands, the Iron Maw, fell under the corrupting influence of a chaos sorcerer known only as Vorozhul the Shattered. Vorozhul's whispered promises of power and vengeance found eager ears among those berserkers who already felt betrayed by their brethren and their commanders. Vorozhul's influence twisted the Iron Maw's ancient rituals, warping the Pact of the Anvil into a blasphemous covenant. Their once sacred rites became acts of profane bloodletting, and their brutal assaults took on an unholy savagery that even other berserkers feared. The Iron Maw's fall from grace was swift and terrible, culminating in a catastrophic engagement against loyalist berserker warbands on the ruins of the Forge World Krithis V. There, brother fought brother beneath skies darkened by the burning remains of titanic war machines. The battle ended in annihilation for the Iron Maw, but their corruption lingered like a poison, seeping into the memory and soul of the chapter's scattered remnants. Meanwhile, on the opposite side of the sector, another warband, the Steel Phalanx, struggled to maintain the old doctrines. They fought with a grim determination to restore the chapter's honour, holding fast to the principles of the Codex Astartes amid a galaxy gone mad. But their victories came at a terrible cost, their numbers dwindling as they faced overwhelming enemies on multiple fronts: orcs, tyrannids, and traitorous elements within their own ranks. The Steel Phalanx's campaign to reclaim lost honour was a desperate gambit, one marked by sacrifice and a growing fanaticism that blurred the line between righteous fury and madness. The Imperium's response was hesitant. The Adeptus Terra recognised the need to harness whatever power remained in the Berserkers, but their patience was thin. The Inquisition, particularly the Ordo Hereticus, deployed agents to monitor and, where necessary, intervene in the chapter's affairs. These agents walked a delicate line, seeking to purge corruption without destroying the chapter outright. It was a balancing act of political intrigue, covert operations, and brutal enforcement, often playing out in shadowed corridors far from the front lines. Beyond, internal strife. The galaxy itself shifted beneath the weight of greater threats. The Tyrannid hive fleets, relentless and insatiable, began pushing ever closer to the sectors where Berserker warbands roamed. The hive mind saw opportunity in the fractured defenders, and its bioships darkened the skies of many worlds once held by the chapter. The Berserkers fought with the desperation of cornered beasts, their savage assaults buying time but never delivering lasting victory. The cost was measured in endless death, the loss of gene seed, and the fading of hope. In the midst of this chaos, a figure emerged, a mysterious leader known only as the warlord Exarch Malric. His origins were unclear, his motives inscrutable. What was undeniable was his charisma and ruthlessness. He claimed lineage from the original Iron Fang companies and sought to reunite the fragmented warbands under a single banner once more. His vision was one of rebirth through fire, a cleansing of weakness and heresy alike. Yet, even as some warbands rallied to his call, others resisted, wary of exchanging one tyranny for another. Malric's campaign to reunify the Steel Berserkers was marked by bloody skirmishes, political intrigue, and relentless pressure from enemies both inside and out. His presence brought renewed focus to the chapter's fractured soul, but it also stoked old resentments and rivalries. Every victory he won was shadowed by the cost paid in lives and loyalty. His iron will was the hammer, but the anvil beneath was cracked and ready to shatter. As the Berserkers' story unfolded across the stars, legends and dark rumours grew around their shattered state. Some whispered of pacts made with ancient Xenos entities, others spoke of lost gene seed tainted by warp energies. The Mechanicus' reluctance to support them fed these tales, as did the increasingly unorthodox rituals performed by some warbands. To many, the Steel Berserkers had become a mythic symbol of a chapter walking the razor's edge between salvation and damnation. Yet, in the darkest corners of the galaxy, beneath the void where light fears to tread, a deeper threat loomed, one that had watched the Berserkers decline with patient malice. An ancient force, older than the Imperium itself, whose designs on the shattered chapter were yet to be revealed. The echoes of ruin, it seemed, were only the prelude to a greater darkness. The time for fractured skirmishes and whispered rumours had ended. The crucible of shadows descended upon the Steel Berserkers like a ravenous tempest, tearing through the remnants of their once proud chapter with brutal finality. This was no ordinary campaign, no mere conflict between warbands or a purge by Imperial agents. It was a cataclysm, an irreversible upheaval that would forever alter the fate of the savage warriors bound by the Pact of the Anvil. The spark was ignited in the dark corridors of the ancient forge world of Ethyrus Prime, a place long scarred by warp, storms and steeped in forbidden knowledge. Here the remnants of the corrupted Ironmaw warband had taken refuge, carving out a twisted domain from the ruins of machine temples and blast furnaces. Their blasphemous rites had deepened into a cult of destruction, their technology fused with warp-tainted sorcery in a horrific synthesis that defied comprehension. The Imperium's response was swift and merciless, A joint force of loyalist Steel Berserkers, Adeptus Mechanicus Scitari legions, and an inquisitorial strike team descended on Aetheris Prime, intent on eradicating the heretical enclave and restoring order. Yet, what they found was a crucible unlike any other. A battleground where the very fabric of reality seemed to warp and fray beneath the ceaseless barrage of chain blades and plasma fire. The battle raged for months, each day a relentless nightmare of shifting alliances, ambushes, and betrayal. The corrupted berserkers fought with feral desperation, their minds fractured by the dark pacts they had forged, while their loyalist brethren waged war with grim resolve, haunted by the sins of their brethren and the scars of their past. The Adeptus Mechanicus forces sought to unravel the arcane devices that powered the enemy's war engines, while the Inquisitors hunted down the cult's warlocks and sorcerers in shadowed corridors. It was during this hellish conflict that the true nature of the threat revealed itself. From the warp's depths, an ancient entity stirred, a forgotten demon lord bound within the very forges of Aetheris Prime, whose awakening had fueled the corruption of the Iron Maw. This demon, known only as Malgreth the Ironborn, was a creature of both machine and spirit, a blight upon the Mechanicies' sacred domains, and a scourge upon the Emperor's warriors. Malgreth's influence seeped through the battlefield like a poison, twisting the minds and bodies of all who dared approach. Loyalist berserkers found their weapons malfunctioning, their armor's ceramite plates cracking beneath invisible forces. The corrupted warband seemed to draw strength from the demon's presence, their rage and savagery swelling to unnatural heights. The line between reality and nightmare blurred, and the warriors fought not only against flesh and metal, but against the shadows that clawed at their souls. In the final days of the siege, as the fortress temple of the Iron Maw erupted in cataclysmic fire and ruin, the High Warlord Malric led a desperate assault to confront Malgreth itself. The battle was a crucible of fire and steel, a titanic clash that shattered the fortress's foundations and rent the warp veil. When Malric finally struck the demon down, it was not without cost. His body was broken, his mind scarred, and the chapter's unity shattered beyond repair. The Crucible's aftermath was a shattered landscape of death and betrayal. The loyalist and corrupted factions lay broken, the warband scattered to the far reaches of the galaxy. The Adeptus Mechanicus withdrew their support, condemning the Steel Berserkers as an unredeemable contagion. The Inquisition placed the chapter under strict surveillance, their agents embedded within the surviving warbands as both watchers and executioners. Yet, even as the chapter teetered on the brink of oblivion, the steel-hearted survivors clung to the Pact of the Anvil. Their fury, now tempered by loss and darkness, burned with a new purpose: to reclaim their honour, to forge a new destiny from the ashes of their ruin. But the shadow of Malgreth's corruption lingered, a stain upon their souls, and a reminder that the greatest enemy was not the Xenos or the heretic, but the darkness within. The Crucible of Shadows was not merely a battle, it was a transformation. The Steel Berserkers ceased to be what they once were, reborn into something both more savage and more haunted. Their legend grew darker, their fury deeper, and their path forward uncertain. In the endless war of the galaxy, survival is victory, but at what cost? The answer lay not in their weapons or armour, but in the soul of the chapter itself. The embers of the Crucible of Shadows cooled into a cold ash that settled over the shattered remnants of the Steel Berserkers. Their once proud chapter, forged in fire and blood, now lay fractured and weary, a constellation of warbands scattered across the galaxy's dark frontiers. The glory of old was a memory, replaced by a grim struggle for survival, redemption, and meaning in a universe that offered neither peace nor respite. The aftermath was a landscape of paradox. On one hand, the Imperium's authorities, those cold, unyielding gears of Terra's vast machine, viewed the Berserkers with suspicion, if not outright condemnation. To the Adeptus Mechanicus, they were a relic corrupted beyond salvation, a blight upon the sacred rights of war and technology. The Inquisition, ever vigilant, cast long shadows over their operations, enforcing harsh sanctions, restricting access to rare materials, and mandating constant oversight. Yet despite this, the Imperium needed them still. The galaxy did not wait for healing, it demanded warriors. And in the ceaseless wars of the 41st millennium, the Steel Berserkers remained a force of fury, raw, dangerous, and relentless. Internally, the chapter struggled to find coherence amid chaos. High Warlord Malric's vision of reunification had been shattered by the Crucible, and no leader since had managed to bind the warbands into a cohesive whole. Instead, each faction sought to carve its own path, guided by fragments of the ancient Pact of the Anvil and their own interpretations of honour and vengeance. Some warbands embraced fanaticism, others sought pragmatic alliances with Imperial or Xenos forces, a few even flirted with the darker whispers of the Warp, desperate for power to restore their fractured chapter. This fragmentation had consequences far beyond politics and power struggles. The gene seed, the sacred lifeblood of the chapter, was depleted and corrupted. Apothecaries worked tirelessly to preserve what they could, but mutations and sterility increased. Recruits became scarce, forcing desperate measures, accepting neophytes from alien bloodlines, experimenting with forbidden biotechnologies, even utilizing rogue servitors as simulacra for training. Each act was a gamble, a fracture in the fragile web of the chapter's survival. Despite this, the Steel Berserkers' core ethos endured. Their savage fury remained undiminished, tempered by the scars of loss and betrayal but still burning bright. Battles waged by their warbands were brutal, swift, and merciless. They remained unrelenting, savages in a galaxy grown crueler still. The Pact of the Anvil echoed in their hearts, a refrain of destruction and renewal, of fury and sacrifice. Legends grew from these ashes. Tales of lone berserkers standing against entire regiments, of warbands that struck like thunder in the dead of night, of chainswords singing the Emperor's cruel justice. But alongside these stories lay darker myths, whispers of brothers who vanished into the warp, transformed by unholy pacts, or driven mad by the ghosts of their own pasts. The line between hero and monster blurred, and the berserkers embraced that ambiguity as a necessary truth. The galaxy itself seemed to respond to their fate. In sectors where their warbands roamed, local lords both feared and coveted their presence. Some saw in the berserkers a weapon of last resort, a storm to unleash against overwhelming threats. Others regarded them as harbingers of doom, a reminder that even the Emperor's finest were not immune to the corrosive madness of endless war. Yet, amid this maelstrom, a faint glimmer of hope flickered. A secret conclave of Steelrite tech marines and chaplains, those few who remained steadfast in their loyalty to the chapter's original vision, began working toward a new future. In hidden forges and ancient crypts, they sought to restore the gene seed, to cleanse the taint of corruption, and to rekindle the fires of unity. Their efforts were slow and perilous, shadowed by the ever-present threat of enemies both within and without. This quiet rebirth was not without cost. The sacrifices demanded were profound, and the path ahead uncertain. The survivors knew that the galaxy would not wait for the Steel Berserkers to heal. Wars would rage, enemies would strike, and the crucible of battle would demand ever greater tolls. Yet they embraced the challenge with grim resolve. To live as berserkers was to live as warriors forged in storm and shadow, bound by fury, honour, and the unbreakable pact with war itself. The legacy of the Steel Berserkers, once a beacon of savage might, had become a complex tapestry of glory, tragedy, and resilience. Their saga was a reminder that in the grim darkness of the far future, victory was fleeting, survival was bitter, and the greatest battles were often fought within. As they forged forward into the endless night, one truth remained certain. The Steel Berserkers would not fade quietly into oblivion. Their fury would echo through the ages, a relentless hammer forging the future from the ashes of the past.